At ULI, for those of you who don't know, we say that we truly stand out from the other organizations in the industry by bringing to the same table your developer, investor, architect, planner, designer, engineer, lawyer, anybody who's got anything to do with built environment. At the same time, we found that conversations around important subjects like sustainability, design were also pigeonholed into those respective professional groups. Architects came together to speak about planning subjects, investors came to speak about capital markets, and we thought it would be really interesting to have a platform where all of these ideas could come together, and that's how the Urban Agenda was born. Welcome to the very first session of the Urban Agenda. It's called Urban Renewal Reimagine. And we've got three fantastic speakers. May I invite all three of you to come up, please, and then I'll introduce all of you. Gregory, Vivek, and Rahul.
Sorry, what do you know? Thanks.
All right, let's take our seats. I'm going to do a quick round of introductions. I've got like a whole script here that I will be using. But I think some introductions are in order. I'll start with Gregory. Gregory is an architect and principal designer at Benoit. And he's an internationally exhibited architect-artist with over 15 years of experience. And his expertise is mainly on large-scale mixed-use, heritage, and master plan projects across Asia. And Gregory, I just learned this, that you were awarded the Perspective 40 Under 40 Designer Award and are also winner of the prestigious Reba Goldfinger Prize. Welcome, Gregory.
Yeah.
We have next Rahul Reddy, who is the founder of Subco Specialty Coffee Roasters. And I want to do a quick check in the room, show of hands for everybody who's been to Subco. Oh, all right. For those of you who, I know you know Subco, but I don't know if you know that Rahul decided to leave behind a career in technology, social enterprise, and risk analyst to train as an apprentice at a specialty coffee company called City of Saints in Brooklyn, New York. And that journey has then led him, of course, to create Subco and to here now with us. Welcome, Rahul. I feel like I should do a show of hands to ask about who doesn't know Vivek. And don't lift your hand if you don't, because that will not be good for you. Vivek Vivek is the founder of the Quorum Club, but I also don't know if you know this, but Vivek comes from a background in finance and economics, and in his previous roles has hatted in both hospitality and also in finance, right? You've split your career between the two, and has now founded the Quorum across 3 locations, all 3 of which I have the fortune of having visited. The Hyderabad being his newest venture. Welcome, Vivek, and thank you for hosting us and partnering with us.
Thank you for being here.
So I'll jump right into it. Today's subject is called Urban Renewal Reimagine. It revolves around adaptive reuse. And for those of you who don't know, I'm an architect and planner, and adaptive reuse for me is in my vocabulary. It's a subject that I'm very passionate about. But I imagine there's 2 other architects in this room, and not a lot of people are familiar with what adaptive reuse is. So if I can pass it on over to Gregory, our resident designer, architect, 40 under 40 winner. If you could set the stage a little bit, tell us about what adaptive reuse is, that would be great.
So, hi everyone. So, adaptive reuse sounds like a scary, mysterious thing, but it's something that we all do and we have done in many cases in our lives. I was thinking about an example, and one thing came to my mind is, I don't know, you know what people do with their saris in villages. So after you wear your sari and it's been used for years and it's getting too torn, you start putting it into different use, and you weave it together and it becomes a bed sheet. I think it's called a gandera. and it becomes something completely different what it used to be. So that is adaptive reuse. It's taking something that might not really be very useful and giving it a completely new life and turning it into something different. And that's what we do in architecture. So sometimes we take it very granted that it's much easier to demolish a building. That's what we were just chatting about. It's so much easier to demolish and build something new. But actually buildings are very resilient. Some of the examples of adaptive reuse is like 2,000 years old. If you look at the Colosseum from Europe, and I'm coming from, it was built 2,000 years ago, and it went through like 10, 15 different uses. Originally, it was an amphitheater for gladiators, but then later on, it was a vegetable garden, it was a fortress, it was a shrine, it was housing, it was a dormitory. So it had billions of uses, and generally buildings are very versatile. They can be used for many things. So this is what we want to talk about today, is how you can reuse some of the buildings that are around us for different purposes. And the relevance of this is actually sustainability. So what our industry, the built industry, contributes about 40%, 38% of global carbon emissions. And that's a big number. So we kind of grew up in the mindset that architects, we are kind of good people, and we kind of learned in the past couple of years that we're actually part of the problem. So that 40% is a huge number, and roughly 50% of that 40% is embodied carbon, which is the actual built structure of the building. It's not necessarily cooling and the electricity, it's the actual structure. So if you can find ways of retaining the existing buildings, you can actually do a lot of good things for the environment.
Absolutely. Thanks, Greg, for packaging adaptive reuse into that. I love the sari analogy. But if we were to take some of these principles, Rahul, and apply it to what you've done with Subco, I'll give you some background. Gregory and I went on a site visit yesterday to your Bandra location.
Okay.
And we were thinking, how did Rahul even go about choosing this as a location for Subco? And it's the same across all of your locations, right? Whether it's Kolaba, whether it's Baikla, there are all these spaces that you've maybe applied adaptive reuse principles to. I don't know if the language exists in that manner, but if you could take us through your thought process into choosing those locations that you have for Subco in Mumbai.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry, can you hear me? It's good? Okay, cool. Yeah, it's an interesting question because starting off, arriving in Bombay and thinking through this concept of building sort of an evolutionary coffee roasting project and sort of bakery project, what occurred to me was two key components. One was we wanted to build in what would aspirationally become an institution to the craft, and that was sort of like nothing less than that was really viable. Subco was always an idea that would either, I guess, be something like it is today or just die off like really fast. And in order for that to be possible, the components from the built environment perspective, I think had a couple of key components. One was a level of discoverability that I felt needed to be packaged into the entire ethos of the idea of Subco. And in terms of physical space, that just meant it couldn't be in a commercialized zone. And so the first thing was, okay, could we create, in order to create a new perception and new construction in someone's mind around an industry and try to redefine it, the actual physical embodiment of that industry also had to be redefined. And ironically, that meant going backward and figuring out an environment that already existed, adaptive reuse, and inputting it into that kind of a structure. So the funny story about the Bandra West space you're describing, the first space we ever tried to convert, I don't know if that's the right word, but I'm using the word convert, was the only space that I ever considered for subco. So it was a very weird situation that fixated me for probably about 9 months. And I was lured to consider all sorts of other spaces that would have made it a lot easier, to be honest, to get off the ground. And Vivek and I were just chatting about the pangs and the difficulty of basic things like services. I mean, it's just like a bit of a nightmare to build some components of, especially in an F&B context, in a building like that. But yeah, those are sort of some of the components of why we chose that space. The last thing I wanted to add on the Bandra space was just, it led me to this notion that, you know, what does it mean to be sort of like a responsible gentrifier? And this is something that I always kind of questioned a lot in my own mind, because I was sort of a student of the humanities before all of this, and oftentimes I was philosophically very much on this side of like, okay, like gentrification is a bad thing, and like how do we preserve communities, and then I started to like think a bit more maturely about the idea of what gentrification means in a contemporary construct, and it, you know, I think there is a way to build into communities fairly responsibly. Our Bandra space is a very good example of this, because we're literally entrenched within a community. Like you can't even, like you were saying, I mean, you can't escape the neighbor's, you know, dog like pooping on your front step, and like 15 cats, and it's very, very entrenched. And yeah, that led to future decisions such as converting a printing press in Baikala, not far from here, and an old textile mill in Kolaba where we make chocolate. So same philosophy sort of applied and streamed through.
That is really interesting, especially the point about positive gentrification, because I've studied this for a particular government within Seoul, where they were looking at gentrification as a strategy, positive gentrification, and there's 4 separate terminology for it, as a strategy for how to revive spaces that were dying simply because of the rising rents. So how do you then kind of use gentrification to its strength to create community? But I'd be very curious to hear quickly from Gregory on what he thinks about that, having visited both the space in Bandra and knowing a little bit about gentrification as a side effect of adaptive reuse projects.
I think for me it was very interesting to find these spaces, because they are in streets where you wouldn't expect them. And I don't think you can say that it gentrified the area, because it's still, when you walk on those streets, you don't expect to find Subco in a hidden building. But I think it's for me that really adds to the creates a very authentic experience. When I walk in that neighborhood, that I don't feel like that I'm walking in a touristy, gentrified area. I feel like I walk in a very kind of genuine part of Bandra, and it's really that very personal experience of discovering something that you don't expect there. And I think that creates a sense of ownership, is that I feel like I discovered this. And I think that's one of the reasons why people like to go there, because they are part of that very authentic experience. And that I don't think you can find that in a shopping mall. It's just impossible.
What?
I agreed.
Thank you. I want to pass it on to Vivek. Vivek, you know, I was in Paris recently and I visited the office of REP. I don't know if anybody here knows it, but they're basically the design and research arm of SNCF. And they've converted an old railway station into their office. And for me, when I walked in, I was like, oh, wow, this is a cool office project. And as our resident and office expert, I wanted to pick your brains on how these principles of adaptive reuse that Greg outlined earlier reflect in your mind. What are your thoughts on them?
Did the office shake being on the...
No, the trains are not there.
Trains are not there. You know, actually, we started talking about doing this conversation, Manasvi, and I threw my hat in and said I'd be happy to give you my perspective. I feel like, personally for our journey, we started the Quorum in Gurgaon in 2018, and it was 35,000 square feet. So I needed a big piece of real estate to get started. And as a first-time entrepreneur without sort of a big corporate backing, no one would give me real estate. And I think it took me almost 2 years to find real estate. And not because I was trying everything, I tried pretty much everything. So it's interesting, I think accidentally, we managed to get what has now become like the most prime real estate in Gurgaon. It's in Horizon Center. It was a Heinz developed grade A commercial building. I think one of the first true grade A, careful, a couple of office owners here, so I don't want to compare. But I think we saw, so we built our hospitality concept inside an office building just because we didn't have a choice. But I think what we saw is that a few things started to change. I think they were already probably changing when we did it, but without us realizing. But I think post-COVID, I think everyone around here knows that the real estate asset class of office is kind of going through a big reinvention. People are structurally now a little bit more hybrid. Some of these trends are a bit more pronounced in the Western markets. I mean, you hear some really interesting stories of office buildings trading for, cents on the dollar in key markets like New York and London and, all over the US for that matter. But so I think we accidentally stepped in and built a hospitality, quite a sort of significant hospitality core inside an office building. And I think now I think in hindsight, once looking back and in the context of this conversation, we're seeing that there's a reimagination happening. And in that context, I think you could say that it's a little bit of a reuse of a existing asset class to another use. And I think we've now spent 6 years doing this. We have 3 clubs. We have another brand called District 150. And I'm increasingly getting convinced of this thesis that the office building. And I think from a sustainability perspective, you're right. We're not preserving old buildings per se, but we're reimagining the use of an existing asset class. And these office buildings tend to have good parking. They're made for the large movements of people in and out. They're usually sort of slightly emptier at night. So so just a better, more efficient, higher optimization of an existing asset class. So I think about it a lot more now. I think it's accidental. It's because of hindsight. When we were doing it, whoever gave us a piece of real estate, we were ready to. We would have done it anywhere. Our first one, just because no one. But it was tough to close that when we first got started.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you are being too humble, because I think what you are doing, it is not just about this space. I think this space is adding actually a lot of value to the tower and to the surrounding that you are occupying. So
we now tell everyone that now, but I'm just saying when we got started, we really, it was really the only piece of real estate I could get my hands on. Now, yeah, sure, I could try and wax eloquently about the benefits of having this, the amenitization of the office building. But these are the trends that really have only come to the fore in the last 2 to 3 to 4 years. I think COVID, for a lot of things, was an accelerator. I think it was an accelerator for this asset class as well, in terms of the reimagining. But when we did it first, I think it was, at the time, I'm not sure, we didn't know what we were doing at the time. We're still trying to figure out what we're doing now, but at that time, we definitely didn't know what we were doing as.
Thanks, Vivek. I want to, what you were saying is also that it was accidental. And sometimes what happens, is also, it's difficult to foresee what are the challenges. I think when you start out with something and then you see it taking its own life, it's the beauty of the adaptive reuse project, but also it's a challenge as well. And I want to go to you, Rahul, to ask you, you've really, done some of the most amazing adaptive reuse projects in the heart of South Mumbai. You look at that Kolaba location, and I wonder how you've done it. Can you take us through some of the challenges that you might have faced when bringing that to life?
Yeah, where do I start?
It's a laundry list.
There is a laundry list. I mean, I obviously don't want to bore you guys with limestone walls that reach up to like 100 feet and stripping it and trying to figure out how to make it porous-ish to make it remain authentic, but then not too porous. I mean, that's a separate discussion. Principally, I think, specifically with that Colaba space that we affectionately call the cacao mill, old textile mill, now transforms cacao into chocolate, hence. I think the biggest challenges there were 2 or 3 things. So in many senses, I mean, Vivek and I have like almost polar opposite philosophies on this particular thing, perhaps. But thanks to Vivek, he's actually one of the first people that believed in our brand and collaborated with us a long time ago. So shout out to Vivek on that. But the Colaba project was rooted in, I think, has anybody been to this space before? The cacao mill? Okay, a couple of you. So the first thing I think you'll notice is if someone describes its location, you'd say, oh, it's off the Colaba Causeway, which sounds like it'd be like in this bustling area and like, it's like just, it's somewhere like next to, I don't know, like a Tommy Hilfiger store or something, right? But it's down like this, was basically like the last 4 remaining kind of residential bylanes of Colaba, at least of that causeway area, sorry.
Pasta lane, right?
Yes, called Pasta Lane, which apparently is the surname of a gentleman and has nothing to do with the edible pasta. I mean, not really. So one is that the pasta lanes, the nomenclature itself almost created this like loop for me. I was like, okay, Pasta Lane, what is this? Should there be something located in a street called Pasta Lane? So it's almost like you start to conceptualize things on the basis of what already exists around you, and there becomes this I guess that's the definition of adapting. But one thing was that street name called to me in the beginning, the lack of parking was automatically like a huge problem that till this day we're trying to solve. We knew that going in, obviously. I think the other bits that were very challenging there was there's like basically 3 former mills next to each other, but again, just like Bandra, all surrounding that are just homes, and they've been there for apartments, and they've been there for a very long time. So I remember the biggest challenge we had was the ceiling is very high. I don't know how high, but very high. Exactly how high, but yeah. Getting basically our outdoor units for our ACs became an absolute nightmare, and to service that entire building with enough cooling while still retaining the ceiling height, not putting in a false ceiling, not being able to, because there were some sloping issues on the roof, so we weren't able to put it on the roof. It had to go directly behind the building. Now, behind the building was meters away from a bunch of different apartments. And this became a huge sticking point, to the point of like police and BMC and this and that constantly for like 2 months. And it was like, I didn't really know what to do, because, so then we had to go through even more, and it's gonna answer some of your other questions, I think, even more expenditure on, so this is to Vivek's point, actually, on kind of soundproofing the entire mechanism of all the ducting and all of the AC units. And that became really difficult to do and added a lot of expense to the project that I didn't see coming, to be honest. So that was one very key challenge that I recall. The second was how to build a mezzanine that did not take away from, sort of the authenticity of the original structure, whilst also adding enough value to make the concept viable financially, to have enough seating in the space. And so, yeah, I think that interplay was quite challenging in Colaba.
Can I ask a question, and both to you, Gregory and Rahul? I mean, one of the things that we look at in hospitality and you're serving people is FLS, fire life safety. Inherently a little bit more difficult to do in such buildings. And Greg, I don't know, from your perspective, you've done a lot more of this globally, but it's something that I think about when we're looking at, because you're serving guests, there's a high degree of responsibility that you need to, even if you have to go over and above what the code is actually in the city. And I don't know if that's something that's been a stumbling block in some of these readaptive reuse projects from your perspective.
Well, quite often when you do these adaptive reuse projects, you have to bring them up to contemporary standards of safety and fire regulations. So at the moment we are doing a reuse of an old tower building in Singapore. And that meant that we had to put in a new staircase. And it's a 25-story tower. We have to stick a new staircase onto the facade in order to make it compliant for today's standards. And you had to do it in a way that actually that staircase outside of an office tower doesn't look embarrassing. It actually looks good. So we are just completing this project. If you go to Singapore next time, please have a look at it. It's actually quite interesting to see how much hurdles you have to go through in order to retain that existing structure.
And you know, just scheduling of your project, right? As Rahul knows this better than anyone else. You know, in the ordinary course, you start from the roof and then you come down. But here, then you got to go up suddenly and come. So the whole scheduling of your project gets a lot more complicated. There are a lot of things that you've got to solve for at site. So there's a time and cost sort of, so the trade-off is always there from, you know, authenticity and being true to what your brand is to sort of managing this. So I don't know if you, I'm an advocate, I'm not advocating against it. I'm just saying these are the challenges that probably one.
I think you're being very realistic, and any investor is looking for predictability. And this is the exact opposite of it. It's very difficult to predict anything. But also you can find outcomes that you could not predict before. But also a lot of challenges that you didn't see.
But my question also to you, Greg, is, you know, as a designer who comes in on a project, right? Like let's take everyone here through a journey. Somebody says, okay, I see this fabulous, you know, structure. Let's kind of see how to give it a new breath of life. And they come to you and they say, Gregory, I want X, Y, Z done. You have the biggest job as the designer to think within the box. Can you take us through your thought process as to what goes into an adaptive reuse project from a design perspective?
So when I started working well, first of all, I think we need to clarify a little bit, because there's a romanticism with this adaptive reuse, and it's not always the case. We think about adaptive reuse as nice heritage buildings, but the majority of the cases they are not. And I think many of you by kind of thinking that I don't have any heritage building, this is not my problem. But the majority of the adaptive reuse projects are not 100 years old, they are 20-year-old ugly concrete buildings that you would never think there is why would I want to retain it? Or there's any point of retaining it. And the challenge of the industry is how you can retain these old buildings in order to reduce our carbon emissions. And if you look around in Mumbai, there's a lot of heritage buildings, but there's a lot more ugly concrete buildings. And if we can find a second life to them, we actually do a lot of service to the city. So the whole the thought process of working on adaptive reuse, I'm finding it a lot more interesting than many of the greenfield new build projects. When I first started working on these about 6 years ago, people were wondering, why do I bother? Why don't I just build a new building? Why would I bother with someone else's building? But in my experience as a creative practice, when you build something new, it's actually very limited how much you can bring in new ideas. If you build a new office tower, we know what it is. There's going to be a core in the center, there's going to be an offset of space, there's going to be a curtain wall on the outside. There's not that much you can innovate. But if you tell me that you have a shopping mall and no more need for retail, we've been looking at a space like this in Seoul, a big shopping mall, no need for retail. Can you turn that into an office space? Well, that's a challenge. And there you really have to innovate. So yes, you kind of have to think physically inside of the box, but in a way, creatively, these are the projects where you can really have to think outside of the box. And your developers have to be a lot more open-minded, because the default thing doesn't work. That's why you have to rethink that space. So I think there's tremendous amount of creative opportunities in these projects. So I really enjoy doing them.
I love how you said that, adaptive reuse is not romantic, and it's usually buildings that are 15 to 20 years old that you're working with. Vivek, the building that we're in was built in 2010. That brings this to about 15 years of its lifetime. You recently renovated both the Quorum Mumbai and the Quorum Gurgaon. What is your thought process when it comes into, putting in the effort to renovate in a building that's 15 years old?
Yeah, I think renovation's easier, honestly. I think if we had something, a blank canvas, I think that would have been a more kind of interesting story to tell. On renovation, you're kind of limited by, the broad structure and the services layout, because we didn't really touch any of that. So you broke a couple of walls and changed a few things. So I think, and the look and feel and a little bit of lighting. So I think it was superficial. I don't think it was a structural renovation either in Gurgaon and Mumbai. But Hyderabad was interesting because we had a blank canvas. So there was a lot more of the ability to think creatively, think about flow of service, flow of guests, flow of, for us, we attempt to activate our place morning through evening. So, how does that transformation take place, and design plays a big part of it. Adjacencies of what should be close to that. So, I had no idea what design and build was all about till about 7 years ago, and I think now it's what I enjoy the most. Operating of the business is not fun at all. I mean, it's managing people and your guests. I mean, I enjoy it, but the creative part is a lot more interesting. But I think I don't know if I may sort of. I think one of the more exciting things we've done, and we've done it actually in collaboration with Rahul. We created this new concept called District 150, and I think conceptually, and Rahul and I are both working hard to still kind of make it fully, sort of get activated as we speak. But I think conceptually, that's a total reimagination of a end utility in a completely sort of different built environment, and that's what we're really excited about. And I think that's where there was a lot of creativity that's gone into it, but we're paying the price for being a bit early. So when you have to sort of we have to sort of educate the consumer.
But from a choosing perspective, if you had to situate a District 150, or if you had to kind of choose a new location for the queue, would you consider an old building?
No, listen, now it's a financial thing. I love the office asset class. I'm realizing that developers want these hospitality amenities. Their tenants want it. The tenants don't mind paying a little bit more to be in the building. That's the developer economics 101, where you get a higher yield or velocity. And if we are able to prove that we can be a small catalyst in doing that, then we can get a slightly better deal for ourselves. And then I just think thanks to all the institutional capital that's gone in, as a organized asset class, there's quite a lot of real estate in office. So if you just look at our demand-supply imbalance, for me, trying to find a Bandra subco type location is a needle in a haystack, and then to go through all the permissions and the parking and all of that. So for us, it's innovative, and it's an easier solution, to try and scale. Scale's a big word, but try and scale, yeah.
And for me, that's really interesting because it's so starkly contrasting with what Rahul has done. And Rahul, I want to pick your brains on, because Vivek brought up finances, I have to question you on this as well. Is it actually more financially viable to take something, like an old mill property and then repurpose it? Or did you have to invest more in your subco locations to bring it to life and have that element of history, connection, culture?
So I think it depends on your end goal, right? So I look at this as from the perspective of brand building, massively financially viable. Probably by far the best decision that we've made. I'll add two caveats. One is we're renters, so on a rental basis, also very beneficial financially.
As long as you have a long-term rental contract.
Yeah. As long as
the value and they kick you out. I mean, you don't want to be.
That's another question. But yeah, from a sort of optimization of the rental perspective as well, also beneficial. I'd say the negative definitely comes in with regards to the capex and the unexpected scenarios that we sort of discussed earlier, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And for example, like we added 2 floors to the Bandra space about now maybe 9-10 months ago, or about a year ago now. And during that exercise, there used to be an office upstairs, and it was functioning perfectly fine. So I was like, okay, great. Like, we've got a blueprint downstairs. We'll just expand it upstairs, and it's going to be easy. As soon as I got a structural audit done, the guy was like, okay, so you want to have 100 people standing on this floor? Like, you're going to have to reinforce the shit out of all of these beams. And suddenly my project cost changed, right? So yeah, I think at the outset, definitely a lack of predictability from like a capex point of view. Depending on your goal, I mean, long term, I feel that these experiences were able to give people, bring us to the extent of influencing the FMCG portion of things. So there's a big leap that can happen in terms of the authenticity element of things. And for me, that made sense. That being said, the funny part is that I actually understand and agree with a lot of what Vivek said, and the audience is shared. So interestingly enough, as people go through their needs really in their daily life, Vivek's audience, our audience, tends to be almost exactly the same. And so I think I think there's room, I guess, for malleability in the notion of adaptive reuse.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also then brings me, like how you were saying that you extended upwards. I want to bring it back to Greg to ask you, Greg, how can design decisions make a project or an adaptive reuse project more financially viable? And if you can tell us with some examples of what you've done.
I have one example that is kind of halfway between Vivek and Rahul. We are doing a project in Singapore that is made out of 16 heritage shop houses, a retail podium, about 25 years old, and the Grade B office tower, all kind of not working together. And our scope on this project started before the client bought the property. And we help the client to assess whether this is a good decision to buy this, and how they can actually maximize value, and how they can turn all of these separate bits, the old shop houses and the office tower, into something that works together as one coherent destination. So we work with them on this feasibility. At the end, the client was a lot more convinced that they can get a lot more out of this than they thought. So they bought the property, and we are about to finish the whole renovation of the project, but the outcome is already very visible. So they bought the property for about 400 million USD. They spent about 50 million USD to upgrade it. And the impact of it is very significant. So from a financial perspective, they had about 70% occupancy before, and now it's 100%. It wasn't an impressive looking building. It was an eyesore of Singapore, and it turned into something that became a pride of that area. And it became something that works together with the heritage, but there's a contemporary part of it. It became a destination, and it managed to attract clients that otherwise would never consider an office building like this. So there is a very strong sustainability story to.
Greg, I have a quick question, because I know Singapore is probably the most evolved urban planning organization that at least I've been exposed to. Manaswini, I'm sure you've seen more. They think a lot of today, and obviously they see value in the sustainability of this. Do they give any incentives around readaptive reuse versus building? And should there be? I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are, because I think that's an interesting way to look at it. Is should it be incentivized not to, break down something that has 50% embedded carbon in the walls?
In some countries there are incentives, but many countries, especially in Asia are suffering from this not being supported. So in this case, we had to put in a new staircase onto the tower in order to be able to renovate it. So I think there's a lot of things that the government could do to encourage this behavior.
Well,
I think also, fair point, Vivek. I think what you're saying is that if there was an incentive to go about adaptive reuse, then maybe developers and people involved would be more prone to you doing that kind of project, as opposed to saying, okay, this is an old asset, let's tear it down and let's do tabula rasa, right?
I see one incentive that is not coming from the government, but is actually coming from the tenant side, is that a lot of global tenants are looking for to be housed in a sustainable development, because that's actually part of their
ESG.
Yes. And they are willing to pay extra for it. So what happened in this case is that it not only increased the capacity, but the new tenants are actually paying more than the old tenants used to pay. And they are much better, higher quality tenants that they had before.
Super interesting. I know that we're nearly towards the close of our discussion. I want to quickly throw it to Rahul. Rahul, I know that you have a new location opening up tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
Day after. Can you tell us a little bit about the character of this location? Is it the same in Bangalore as it is in Mumbai?
Yeah, that's okay. We haven't talked about this yet.
Okay, if you can't talk about it, that's okay.
Yeah, so we do. It's opening Sunday, I presume, unless things go badly. So yeah, interestingly, it's we seeked out a pretty similar concept, sort of concept arc to what you see in Bandra. It's a 70-year-old home, again, sort of a 3-story structure. And it, interestingly, it's weirdly kind of located on the first, what they call double road in Bangalore. So it's the first road with 2 sides, I suppose, that developed in Bangalore. And now Bangalore is, well, anyone that's been to Bangalore understands the joke about the traffic and the roads. But yeah, so yeah, that is it's another space that we've converted, and I suppose you could term it as a heritage space. So interestingly, in that project, what we did thematically was it had this one very stark element that I wanted to preserve and conserve, despite the fact that it didn't fit our original thesis on interior language, and that was red oxide. Yeah. So red oxide is quite typical in South Indian households, in older homes. As far as I'm aware. And this whole house was just like cracked, beautiful, just almost, red oxide. So that then became sort of part of the brand language. We built bench seating that had red oxide that sort of flowed from the original flooring into the benches. We started to kind of evolve our own brand tonality around the red oxide. So I think that was quite rewarding for us in that particular structure. So it's our first flagship in any city outside of Bombay, actually. So next week onward, if anyone's in Bangalore, please consider going by.
Look for the double road.
Look for double road, yeah.
I mean, very quickly, I also know how difficult red oxide is to work with. I'm sure all your artisans must have come from Auroville, because they're the only ones who are able to do red oxide flooring, whatever, anywhere. So you'll have, I feel you. I want to quickly close this discussion out by asking each of you. We are in Mumbai, and I think that as Mumbai grows, adaptive reuse is going to become more and more of a subject to think about. If there was one building, project, something that comes to your mind that you think would be perfect for adaptive reuse, which one would it be? I'm also going to take this out to the audience so you can think about it for a bit.
Well, if you look behind us, is I think a couple of thousand acres owned by the Indian Railways. So we'll do it with adaptive reuse there if they're willing to give us the land, or anyone. Listen, I think there's a great opportunity.
Absolutely.
There's tremendous amount of mill land around us where we are, and there's a lot of beauty in that. And I think if if conceptualized properly in a contemporary way, I think it could really sort of retain the character of the city, as well as create something quite magical. But obviously, it's tough to kind of pull something like that off. But if that was the wish list, that was the dream. Yeah.
Absolutely, Rahul.
I'm as a former New York resident, I'm just still, for all of its controversies, I'm still massively in awe of the Highline project that launched in New York, in Manhattan. So for me, I mean, any major city around the world that can convert disused railways into public parks, it's just such a no-brainer. I know there's, climate considerations in cities like Bombay or Singapore, etc., but that's what I would love to see done.
Me too. I haven't seen the Highline, but there's a Highline copy in Seoul. That's one of my favorite public spaces to go to, so I agree with that.
Amazing.
Greg?
But I think I think the High Line is actually very relevant for Mumbai, because there's such a shortage of public space here. That seems to be the biggest scarcity. And what the High Line managed to do in New York was two things. It gave a public space, but it also had to transform an entire neighborhood around it. And it became an amazing vehicle of transformation of a whole part of the city. So I think these are very good and very relevant examples for Mumbai.
But is there one project or something in Mumbai from all of your time here that you would pick?
Well, there are quite a lot of industrial heritage in Mumbai that people don't really get inside or access, and there are really good examples in the world where these have been turned into major destinations, either in New York, or if you look at Lisbon, there's Time Out Market, and that's just a big shed, but that they managed to turn it into something that, if you look at it from the outside, is technically a food court. It's nothing. But when you go inside and you really experience it, it is actually one of the coolest food court experience I ever had. And it's a really big public destination. So if some of these industrial sheds could be turned into something like that, I think it would be pretty amazing.
Yeah. It doesn't take a lot to actually...
It doesn't actually take much.
Absolutely. I'm going to open it up to the floor over here. If anybody here, the same question to the panelists, over to you. If anybody here, in your experience in Mumbai or in your hometown, has a project, site, building that you think would be perfect for adaptive reuse, using all of the principles, ideas, experiences that we've learned about adaptive reuse from today's panelists, what would it be?
My name is Amish. I'm from JLL. One thing I can think of when we talk about public spaces in Mumbai is the malls, because that's something common that every household can think of as a family outing plan, whether it's shopping or F&B and other events also. So, what are your views on adaptive reuse and sort of retrofitting the current malls, because they are already open spaces which Indian households are used to visiting, and turning that around into more common friendly spaces?
Well, we are doing some of those, and then when I said that the majority of the adaptive reuse is actually the old ugly concrete building that no one really would think that it's worth reserving or preserving, that's the majority of the work that we all need to do. And we are doing some of this. So these are happening and coming. And I think they will be happening more and more in the future. And that's what we see as a trend across the whole world. So, for example, in China, we used to do a lot of new build projects. Nowadays, the majority of the work is all renovation of existing buildings. But the really exciting ones are the ones where you don't just turn a nice mall into a nicer mall, because I mean that's very good. But it's the really exciting works are the ones there where you turn it into something else, where that mall becomes a museum or a cultural space or an office space, what I was talking about in Seoul. Those are really exciting spaces and projects.
I have a question. Hi, my name is Samyak, and I think real estate essentially is catering to the human experience and how humans are interacting with the space. Like you spoke about the High Line, Hudson Yards, and a bunch of buildings in Brooklyn, and so on and so forth. So in your own way, in an adaptive reuse project, you're kind of almost trying to predict how the experience would be because it's not been done before, like with your new subco location, right? So how do you actually go about trying to build that journey of the human experience in a totally new kind of a concept? And this is open to everyone.
Well, on any project you would try to predict that human experience, but the interesting thing about working with existing is that there's so many unpredictable elements to it that the design of the space will have to have all sorts of unique conditions that you would not have designed because it just doesn't make sense. But somehow those give the unique character of the space that you could not come up with without those constraints. And to some degree, these are headache, but to another degree, these are the uniqueness of the spaces. Let's say you have a big chimney in the middle of the space. Surely you would not design a big chimney in the middle of the space, but that becomes the identity of the whole space if you design around it.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'm thinking of an example. I think I mentioned earlier the limestone walls in the Kolaba space. It was quite stressful. I agree. I mean, there's been I think at least a couple of random pillars that were in that space that proved very difficult to plan our like little chocolate factory situation around. But once we kind of retrofitted them as like IPS structures that would like sort of be these towering elements of some kind of contemporary adaptation within that mill, it started to serve as a really nice identity. And from there, sort of IPS then became like a thematic element of the whole space that we then sort of adapted through it, right? So I think I entirely agree with what he said.
But even spatially, if you look at the Bandra space, it's so many small pockets of spaces. Surely, if you were designing from scratch,
right.
It would become a Starbucks with a big open space.
Yeah.
But the uniqueness of that space is that there's all of these niches and different pockets of spaces, and everyone can slightly sit separately. The next time I go, I sit in a completely different space. There's a lot to discover.
That's true, and to that point, that's much better example. Thank you. That was so. The first time I told my team about that space, the first thing I heard from people that were in operations was, "There's no visibility for the front of house towards any room. Why are you doing this to us?" Right? I was like, "Because we have to." But that's not the point. Then it was fairly easy on the first floor in that building because it was still just like 2 or 3 rooms. Then we expanded upward, and then it became like 6 rooms on the first floor, 2 rooms on the ground floor, an entire loft, and then so entirely. I mean, we had to build our entire operations flow around the either the opportunity or the drawback of having all of these rooms that we wanted to conserve. So yeah.
Well, what I love about your project is that retail has all of these rules, and your project actually breaks all of them. Like from the starting point, you don't want to open a shop at that place where you did. You're not even on that road, and your shop is actually set off from the road, completely invisible, and then it's broken up into all these different floors, and it's just complete nonsense in terms of retail. Like, don't do it. No?
Agreed. Yeah.
Your operations team must really love you, Rahul.
Yeah, they love you.
If anybody else would like to add something.
Hi, my name is Chavi. Just a few observations. I think this discussion has been really interesting. But as a Mumbaikar, being born and brought up here, I feel like adaptive reuse is very inherent in the city, actually. In very informal, small-scale ways, there is a lot of adaptive reuse that has been happening in the city for many decades. Where the sort of tide turned, or where the need really came first, was when the mill lands shut down, which was a large chunk of real estate space which became available. And I think, I'm sure Manaswini, there were many proposals that time about how to go about that, and for whatever it's worth, we know how it's turned out, and hence now the need for this conversation has become more relevant, because do we want to follow that same profile of development, or do we want to look at things far more sensitively, which is the inherent character of the city, right? I just want to point out another very interesting example of how some of the adaptive reuse projects can also be temporary, right? And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Sassoon Dock art project that START had created. A completely derelict site converted for a couple of weeks into an art project, which brought the community together and suddenly became like the place to go to in the city. There were people lining up, BMC had to issue social media notifications, then please don't show up anymore, it's just too crowded. I mean, that's the impact that something like this can create. And I think we have a lot of potential of doing adaptive reuse to that sense. I think one of you did speak about how there's a dearth of public spaces, open spaces in the city. And in some ways, that perception of adaptive reuse, both in scale, in use, whether temporal or permanent, I think there are many facets to it. I do want to congratulate you, Rahul, because your spaces are fantastic, and I'm sure it is a lot more challenging to take up those, to do what you're doing. But I feel in some sense it is the true Mumbai character that you have kept up to.
Thank you so much, Chavi. I think what I'm hearing is also that the dockyards, I think, are a fantastic example of adaptive reuse, temporary use, how you can activate spaces temporarily, and how pop-up urbanism can actually also be a way of bringing communities together. I completely agree with that. Any other comments, questions? Yes?
Yeah, hi. My name is Pooja. I am an architect and urban designer. My question is, what is the difference between adaptive reuse and redevelopment? Because as Gregory just mentioned, that adaptive reuse is not something to do with heritage or conservation. It is basically a reuse of a space. So what will be the difference when we say a space is reused or a space is redeveloped?
So there's a whole lot of terminologies. There is adaptive reuse, there's repurposing, renovation,
regeneration.
renewal.
I've written a paper about it. I'll send it to you.
I think that there's some nuances of differences of how much it is, how much is retained and how much it is different. But it's technically talking about the same kind of thing. I wouldn't overrate the difference between these terms.
If we had to be super simplistic, I would say redevelopment is tabula rasa and reuse is not. Just very simply put. All right. With that, we come to the end of the very first session of the Urban Agenda. I want to do a quick round of thank yous. I want to thank the team at the Quorum, Ishan and everybody for putting this together. Thank you so very much for setting this up. I want to thank Rahul for flying in just for this event. I want to thank Gregory for flying in just for this event from Hong Kong. Vivek, I'm sure you flew in from somewhere. Thank you so much for doing it. I also want to thank Samyak for flying in from Delhi. And our ULA India chair is also here, Rohan Sikri. Thank you for flying in from Bangalore just to make it for this event. And for all of you for braving the traffic and populating this room. When we began, I was, worried that nobody would turn up. And I'm so happy to see such a nice turnout for this event. We hope to make the Urban Agenda a quarterly series, maybe more frequent depending on how it's taken up. And we hope to see you at all future editions. Until then, we're signing off. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Vanshu. Thank you.